It's time now for our introduction to Fragments. We've previously learned how activities work in Android, how they are the window, the container where all of our app user interface, the app UI goes. And indeed, activities are our entry point to our app. You need to have an activity to be able to use your app. So then, what are fragments and where do they fit in? Just like previously when we learned about activities, the best place to start when learning a new major concept with something in Android is to actually look at the official developer documentation. So just like with activities, I'm going to head over to a browser, find the documentation, and then bring in the key points into this presentation so we can explore them further. So I'm simply going to search for Android fragments, and I can see at the very top I have developer.android.com/guide/fragments. So this is the introduction, the guide that we want to be looking at. And then we can see in the center our introduction to fragments. So just like with activities, the introductory paragraph sums things up pretty nicely for us. A fragment represents a reusable portion of your app's UI, user interface. A fragment defines and manages its own layout, has its own lifecycle, and can handle its own input events. Fragments cannot live on their own, they must be hosted by an activity, or another fragment. So we'll stop there. What we'll do is we'll bring those three major points into our presentation and go through them one by one to explore what they really mean. So bringing those points from the Android documentation into our presentation. First of all, a fragment represents a reusable portion of your app's user interface. And I've gone ahead and underlined the word portion there. So it's key to understand that, unlike an activity, which is the whole window, the whole screen, and that you can't have two activities on screen at once, a fragment can be used to be just a portion of the screen, a portion of the user interface. It is possible to make it fill the whole screen and be the entire UI, the entire user interface, but often you'll see it used as a portion of the screen, whether the main content area above our bottom nav, as we're going to be using it, or perhaps even two fragments side by side, okay? So similar to an activity in that it contains a UI, it contains a user interface, but different in that it can be used, as the name suggests, to be a fragment, a portion, a small piece of the screen. It does not need to fill the whole screen, although it also can definitely be the whole screen if you set it up that way, okay? The second point, a fragment defines and manages its own layout, has its own lifecycle, and can handle its own input events. We'll be talking about lifecycle later on in this section, where we look at the activity lifecycle, and then indeed by extension the fragment lifecycle. Okay, we've seen some of these methods before with the onCreate method in the activities. But very much like an activity, a fragment is a self-contained class, a file, which can use its own layout file, have its own views on the screen, like buttons, text views, edit texts. It is a self-managing thing. Once it's on the screen, a fragment is totally capable of managing everything in that fragment's layout file, just like an activity. And third point, fragments cannot live on their own. They must be hosted by an activity. And I've just put in brackets, or another fragment. You can have a fragment with a child fragment, but we're not going to worry about that for a while. So, taking this point that they must be hosted by an activity, it's not possible to move from an activity to a fragment, and that the fragment is just the screen, the window. Fragments don't have the mechanism to create a window and then set a content view on that. The way that fragments work is they live within an activity, or a fragment. So there'll be some activity on the screen, like main activity, or another activity, and there'll be some sort of container on the screen, a frame layout, or some other kind of view group, and the fragment is added to that container. It's also possible to add the fragment directly in the XML layout file. That's possible too, but most commonly there'll be some sort of container in the activity's layout, and the fragment is added to that activity. And then when it's added to that container, the fragment is hosted by the activity. It is attached to the activity. Okay? But a fragment cannot live on its own. It always lives within a parent activity, and that's an absolutely crucial concept. So let's show these points in a little more detail. So a fragment represents a reusable portion of your app's UI. If I head back over to the documentation now, there's a pretty useful image that Android has given to show what this means in practice. So if I scroll down under the heading called modularity, it talks about modularity and reusability. And when we scroll down, we see two examples: one with a large screen device like a tablet in landscape mode, and one with a small screen device like a typical phone. So if I go ahead and take that image and bring it into our presentation, okay, so we can see large screen on the left, small screen on the right. So the whole phone window, the blue and the green shaded box together, the whole window, that will be our app's activity. And in the activity, there may be some kind of component to help navigate, and that's shown in blue, Activity Navigation UI. On the left, it looks like a drawer layout, some kind of side panel on the left with our options and vertical list, and in the phone layout on the right, that Activities Navigation User Interface, it looks like a bottom navigation bar, like we'll be using in our project. So the activity will have some way to navigate through the app, but then the green shaded area represents where our fragment will live. There'll be some kind of container filling that space, much like we've already done with our activity mains layout. We have a frame layout, a content frame, and as you navigate through the app, as you tap in the activities layout on that blue navigation component, then the fragments get swapped out. They get added and replaced in that content frame. So in this case, the fragment is just a portion of the screen. The activity is responsible for all of the screen, and that often contains a way to navigate, and then the space for the fragment to live. So a reusable portion or fragment of the screen of the user interface. It also says that the fragment defines and manages its own layout, has its own lifecycle, and can handle its own input events. So to show clearly what this means, the best thing to do will be to go to our project now and use Android Studio to create a fragment for us and see what code we get given when we make a fragment. So let's do this now. So back over to Android Studio, and as you can see, I'm in main activity, and I've closed down all of the files. So just like with activities, we can create a fragment from scratch just by making a new file, or we can let Android Studio create a fragment and a layout file for us. So we'll do this now and see what Android Studio gives us. So I'm going to right click in the project pane on the package folder where it says Record Keeper. I'm going to go to New, Fragment, and just for fun, we'll look at the gallery to see what options we have. Okay, so a bit like our add activity wizard, we have a whole lot of options here. Google Maps, login, setting screens, okay, some quite useful modern user interface options. But just to see what the basic default template for fragment is, we'll click fragment blank and then next. And then we can give the fragment a name, and also we can give the layout file a name. So just like with an activity, when we make a new fragment, we also make a layout file alongside it. So I'm going to leave this as blank fragment, and I'm also going to leave the layout file as fragment underscore blank, and leaving the source language as Kotlin, I'm going to click finish. And then if I look at the top, I can see I've got two new files, a layout file called fragment underscore blank, and our blank fragment. Now, there's a whole lot of junk and comments and to-dos that you can see on the screen generated in our template fragment. To be honest, these slightly confusing extra bits of code, Android Studio has been throwing these in with new fragment templates for many, many, many years, and I find them terribly unhelpful. I remember years ago when I first got Android Studio to make me new fragments, and I saw all this stuff, params, green comments above the class, to-dos, all this kind of stuff here. I found it really intimidating. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all of the extra bits we don't need. Also, depending on what version of Android Studio you have, there may be some extra things here, or there might be some less things here. So we'll delete everything that we don't need. So above class, I'm going to delete the green comment above class, okay? I'm also going to delete these two private const val args, so go ahead and delete everything between class and import. I'm going to leave the onCreate method, but I'm going to delete this arguments block, so just leaving super onCreate. I'm going to delete these params at the top, okay? I'm going to leave onCreate view, but I'm going to delete all of this companion object. We don't need this at all, so everything apart from the bottom bracket, I'm going to delete all of this. So actually, the only thing we really need is onCreate view. Now I've left in the onCreate method to show you how we have similar methods to our activities. In main activity, we have an onCreate with a saved instance state, or we have the same looking method in our fragment, okay? But actually, we don't even need the onCreate method. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the onCreate method. And all we really need is our name of our fragment, the fact that it extends the fragment class, okay? So blank fragment extending fragment, and then the onCreate view here. So fragments are very similar to activities. They need to extend the correct class, fragment for fragments, app activity for activities, okay? We extend fragment, and we have some what's called lifecycle methods like onCreate, but the one we really care about for fragments to set the layout file is this onCreate view method. Slightly different to our onCreate method in activities, okay? We've got this inflating thing where we inflate the layout, and we'll be learning how to use this in a later tutorial. So actually, deleting all that extra junk that the template gives us, we see actually that fragments are quite simple, just like activities. So I'm going to go back now to our presentation, and just bring in an example of what the code looks like. Okay, on create view, we've just seen that, and I've shown you another method on view created, which is a place where we can get reference to our views. Okay, I'm doing find view by ID here. It's also possible to use that view binding that we've seen just recently. So very similar to activities. Fragments define and manage their own layouts. You can see the layout file there. It's got its own lifecycle with those lifecycle methods on create view, on view created, and those methods are called automatically, similar to the way activities work. And fragments can handle their own input events. You can see that I'm updating the text on the text view, and that will work just fine. So they are self-contained, self-managing portions of the screen that behave very similarly to activities. And our final point is that fragments cannot live on their own. They must be hosted by an activity or another fragment. So just showing you what this looks like under the hood in practice. So if we have our phone, and the red box there represents our activity. Okay, so we have a new activity, and that's created. And inside the activity's layout is a container, a frame or a container where we can add our fragment. And I've marked that in yellow. So activity in red, then inside activity there's a container, the fragment container in yellow. So to get the fragment to show on the screen, to make the fragment work, the first thing we do is we add a fragment to a container in the activity. So we would make a new instance of our fragment in code, and once we have that fragment variable, that fragment reference, we would add a fragment to that container. Once we add it to the container, the fragment will attach itself to the activity. So under the hood, the Android system will deal with the fragment being connected, attached to the activity, and attaches the correct word. Once the fragment is attached to the activity, the lifecycle method onCreateView is called. And again, this is all automatic, just like with the activity onCreate method. So once we've attached the fragment to the activity, onCreateView is called, and it looks a bit like this. Okay, we've seen that in our blank fragment just a moment ago. And then, once this happens, once we inflate the layout file, the fragment is visible on the screen, and it behaves much like an activity, and the user can interact with it. Okay, but a fragment cannot live on its own. You cannot just launch a fragment from an activity directly. The fragment must be within an activity. That's the key thing to know here. Fragments are hosted by an activity. They are attached to an activity. So that's a quick high-level view of how fragments work and what they are. Just giving you a few examples of how these are used in the real world. So one of the main ways they're used is to create smooth navigation through an app. So some examples of what I mean by this. There may be a bottom navigation bar, an activity that has a bottom navigation bar, and then a content frame for the fragments. And as the user touches the options on the bottom navigation bar, the activity will swap out the fragment. And that gives the user the feeling that they never really leave the screen. They're in one screen, one place. They can move between different portions, different fragments of the app, but they never feel like they're really leaving or going anywhere. If you did this with activities, it would put one activity on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, and the user would really feel like they were getting further and further away from where they were. And then once the user drills down to lots of activities, it's quite hard to then break out of there and go to one of the other bottom navigation options. So by having a bottom navigation bar in the activity and swapping out that fragment in the container, it creates a really smooth flow for the user. Similarly, there's the apps that have a drawer, the hamburger icon in the top left. They can tap the hamburger icon, choose one of the different options. Tapping one of those options will swap out the fragment in the container, but the drawer will still be there. The user won't feel like they've gone anywhere. They'll just feel like they've moved to a different portion, a different fragment of the app. Okay? And then another very, very common one is the view paging, like when you're reading a book. These are the user interfaces where you can swipe left and right, and it will drag the next page or the next bit of UI into view. Okay, and that's called view paging, where you swipe through pages. Again, those pages are represented by fragments, so when you swipe left and right, it doesn't feel like the user is going anywhere. It feels like they're staying in one place, and they're just moving different bits of the app's user interface into view. So fragments are very commonly used to create this smooth navigation flow, so the user doesn't feel like they're leaving the main top part of the app, but also giving the user the option to choose small pieces, small portions to be in view at a time. The home screen, the feed, the options, the profiles, that kind of thing. Fragments are also used to separate screen logic into different classes and files. It would be very easy to put all of the logic of our app in one giant activity, and have all the logic of the screen in one file. Well, if you have different portions or one or two portions of the screen separated into fragments, it breaks the code up a little bit. It makes programming the app and reading the code a little bit more digestible. You might have the code for the account fragment in one file in one class. You might have the code for the newsfeed in another class. So rather than having all of this in one God activity class, you have it in little bits and pieces, and this is recognized as being good programming practice, separating the concerns, having things self-contained and self-managing in smaller files and classes. And finally, another way this might be used is to have certain UI elements persist throughout the screens. For example, you might have the profile image in the top right or the top left. You might have the app logo that stays on the screen the whole time, or settings icon, etc. Okay? You would put these elements in the activity, perhaps on top of the fragment container, on top of where the fragments will live. And then as you navigate through the different fragments, those activity UI elements, like the profile image and the settings icon, they will be visible the whole time, even though you're moving to different screens. Okay? So that's three pretty strong reasons for how and why fragments are used. All of this will start to make a lot more sense as we start to use it in our app. So let's go ahead now, back to our project, and start to add these fragments into our app. We've now learned the what and the why of fragments. It's now time to learn the how by jumping in and adding our first fragment to our activity. So I'm currently in main activity. I have blank fragment and the fragment blank from the previous tutorial open. I'm actually going to close these two tabs and delete those two files because we don't need them. So if you want to go ahead and right click on the layout file, fragment_blank.xml, and then delete, and then OK. If you get any warnings saying that the file appears to be in use at all, just ignore those and go ahead and delete it. So right click, delete. OK, so they're both gone. So the first thing we're going to need to do is create our first fragment. And we'll start with the running fragment, the first fragment on our screen. But before we go ahead and create the fragment class and the layout file, let's go back over to our documentation and have a quick look at the setup guide, as there's one or two things we should do first just to make sure it works properly. So back on the guide, you can see on the right there's a Getting Started section. So when I click this, I can see there's a link to create a fragment. So we'll click this. We've got our introduction again, and then it says set up your environment. Now if I scroll down a little bit, I can see we have a dependency to add a Kotlin one there. Okay, but we also have reference to the project build.gradle file. That's the other file called build.gradle that's in the very top folder in our project. So we'll take a look at that as well in a moment and just talk about what it is and what that does. But just on the dependency, which we're going to add in a moment, you can start using fragments without adding this dependency here. You saw in the previous tutorial, I was able to create a blank fragment and extend from the fragment class. Okay. However, this fragment::ktx dependency, it's going to give us a couple of extra things that will be quite useful to us. It will make adding the fragment to the transaction a little bit easier, and later on we're going to upgrade our frame layout, where we add our fragment, to something a bit better, a bit more robust, as shown in the guide later on. So this dependency, not essential to get going with fragments, but we're going to go ahead and add it right now to make sure that later on when we start doing things like adding the fragment and adding it to a specific kind of container, that we've got everything we could possibly need to do that as easily and as securely as possible. But before we add the dependency, let's have a quick look at this project build.gradle file. As you can see, it's telling us to add inside this repositories block in the build script block, this Google thing, and to also add it in the all projects repositories block, add this Google thing with brackets. Now, pretty much any new project you make in Android Studio is already going to have this, so you're going to see in just a moment how we actually don't need to add anything, that this Google bracket thing is already in there. However, we will jump over to this file in Android Studio just now, we'll take a quick look at it, confirm that we can see our Google thing in the repositories blocks, and add it if for any reason it's not there, and just very quickly talk about what this project build.gradle file does, just so you've got a very basic understanding, as we've been having to avoid it over and over again in this course, as it's not really something we change too much, but it'd be good to know what it is and what it does. So let's go over to Android Studio now, and on the project pane, if I close the very top folder, and then open it again, so that's our root folder, and at this very top level you can see we have a build.gradle file. So go ahead and open this, what's called the project level build.gradle file. Okay, and just for comparison, if you go ahead now and open the app folder, the app module, and then go ahead and open that build.gradle file, so we have them side by side. So build.gradle record keeper, I just scroll to the top, and build.gradle app, and again I'll scroll to the top. So selecting the one with our project, build.gradle, and then in brackets the name of our project, record keeper. If I look at this, I can see there's a build script block here. Inside this I can see there's a repositories block, and I can see I've already got Google, so there's nothing to change there. And again, if I look down, I can see there's an all projects block. Again, there's a repositories block inside this, and again, it's got the Google brackets command there. So nothing to change here. But in very simple terms, let me explain what this file does. You've heard me mention a few times before in our build.gradle file for the app, if I scroll down to the dependencies block, that these dependencies are a bit like ingredients. They're a bit like our shopping list, the things we need to go out and get to make our app. Okay? Well, if this is a shopping list of ingredients, of things we need for our app, well, if I move over now to the project level build.gradle, these repositories are like the supermarkets, the shops where to get those ingredients. Okay? We define here a couple of places, a couple of repositories, a couple of supermarkets where all of the libraries are saved and stored. Google, JCenter. These are the supermarkets, these are the shops. We have to have something here. Otherwise, when we get to our app build.gradle file, well, the app doesn't know where to look to find these dependencies. It doesn't know where to find the items in this shopping list, okay? So, one last time, in the project build.gradle file, we rarely need to touch this. Pretty much when you make a new Android Studio project, this is going to be set up ready with the two main repositories, Google, JCenter, the two main supermarkets, the two main locations where all of the libraries are saved. So if you ever see a guide to installing a new library, whether it's Fragments or something else, and it talks about adding things to this project level build.gradle file, it's usually telling you where those dependencies or that dependency is located. Okay? So now we know we're going to keep avoiding this build.gradle or the project level file, so we can close this down, and I'm now in my dependencies block, so I can head back over to the guide, and I can copy the Kotlin line here. Don't do the Java one, copy this Kotlin one. No need to copy the comment, just the line, copy. I can see it says $fragment version. So that variable refers to 1.3.3. So if I just copy this and paste it underneath the other implementations, just paste it there. And then rather than copying in this variable here, actually I'll just type 1.3.3 directly. So I'll delete $fragment version and type 1.3.3 and then sync now. Okay, so that's now done, so I can close the build.gradle file, and we're now ready to start adding the fragment, adding the layout file, and because we've got that dependency, later on in this section there's a few extra things we can do that make things just a little bit easier. It's not essential, that dependency, but it is if you want some of the shortcuts that are coming later on.